There is a movie sitting in your memory right now. You watched it as a kid. Maybe you caught it late at night on cable. Maybe an older sibling put it on and told you it was fine. It was just action. It was just Schwarzenegger being Schwarzenegger. You settled in. You got comfortable. And then something appeared on screen that made your body go cold in a way you couldn't explain. You thought it was just a fun sci-fi action film. You were wrong. Total Recall was a war. A war between a director who wanted to make you physically sick and a studio that wanted to make $100 million. A war between artists who believed in the power of real, tactile, breathing, sweating horror and executives who were terrified of what those artists were capable of. The effects team built things that shouldn't exist. They grew creatures out of foam and latex and hours of human suffering. They built bodies that looked like God had gotten bored halfway through, and the studio tried to hide it. Not all of it. They couldn't cut it all. But they tried, they pushed, they made calls and sent memos, and sat in screening rooms with their arms crossed and their faces pale. They got about 4 seconds worth of cuts. The rest got through, and the rest is what we're here to talk about. Here are the dark secrets behind Total Recall and the truth that TriStar Pictures tried to hide. Number 1. The mutants were built to make you gag. When you first see the mutants of Mars on screen, your brain does something weird. It doesn't process them as costumes. It doesn't process them as movie magic or special effects or men in suits. It processes them as wrong, as something that violated a rule you didn't know existed. Your stomach moves before your brain does. Your hands get a little wet. You shift in your seat. That is not an accident. That is the result of a very specific, very deliberate conversation that happened between director Paul Verhoeven and practical effects supervisor Rob Bottin before a single piece of foam was ever sculpted. Verhoeven sat across from Bottin and gave him one instruction, not a list, not a mood board. One sentence. Make the audience feel like they need to leave the theater. Bottin didn't use CGI. There was almost none on this film. Every single mutant was hand-sculpted, hand-painted, and worn by a real human being who spent 6 to 8 hours in a makeup chair every single morning before they were allowed anywhere near set. 6 to 8 hours of foam being glued to skin, of prosthetics being layered and painted and sealed, of a person being slowly erased and replaced with something else. By the time they walked on set, they weren't actors anymore. They were something the camera didn't know how to look away from. The sting. You weren't watching monsters, you were watching people disappear inside skin that wasn't theirs. And somewhere under all that latex, a real human being was breathing, sweating, and waiting for Verhoeven to call cut. The first mutant you see isn't even the worst one, not even close. Number 2, the 3-breasted woman was almost cut entirely. You know the scene. Everyone knows the scene. It has been referenced, parodied, and talked about for 35 years. You probably saw it before you were old enough to understand why it was supposed to be provocative. But here's what you don't know. TriStar executives saw the early footage of the 3-breasted woman and called an emergency meeting the next morning. They were not laughing. They were not amused. They thought it was going to get the film slapped with an X rating before it ever reached a theater. They pushed Verhoeven hard. They asked him to cut it, tone it down, to find another way to establish the strangeness of Mars without going to that place. He refused. He told them the scene was not about shock value. It was not a cheap joke or a publicity stunt. It was about a world so broken, so mutated by decades of corporate greed and radiation and atmospheric poisoning, that even the human body had given up trying to be normal. The 3-breasted woman wasn't there to titillate. She was there to tell you Without a single line of dialogue, you were somewhere fundamentally wrong. Somewhere the rules of biology had been rewritten by people who didn't care about the consequences. The actress, Lisha Naff, wore a prosthetic chest piece built entirely by Bottin's team. It weighed close to 7 pounds. The silicone skin had to be matched precisely to her own skin tone under different lighting conditions, which meant multiple fittings and color corrections over several days of prep. She filmed the actual scene in a single day. She later said the costume felt like wearing a living thing, something warm and strange and not quite right, pressed against her body under the lights. That detail stays with you. But if you think that scene pushed the limits of what the studio would tolerate, wait until you hear about the next one, because this one almost ended careers before the film even wrapped. Number 3. The Baby Arms. Rob Bottin almost quit. There is a character in this film named Kuato. If you've seen the movie, you already know his name. If you haven't, I need you to understand what Kuato is before I tell you how he was made. Kuato is a psychic mutant revolutionary. He is the leader of the resistance on Mars. He is the most important character in the second half of the film. He is also a partially formed infant body fused to the torso of a grown man named George, living folded inside George's stomach, hidden beneath his clothing, revealed only when George pulls open his shirt and the thing inside him wakes up. He moves, he breathes, he blinks. He talks. He looks at Quaid with small, ancient eyes and says words that are supposed to mean something. Rob Bottin, the same man who had already shattered the film industry's understanding of practical effects with The Thing in 1982, looked at Verhoeven's concept sketches for Kuato, told him it was too far. He thought it was unfilmable. He genuinely believed that audiences would either laugh or be so disturbed that they'd disconnect from the story entirely. He thought the concept was going to break the movie from the inside. He built it anyway, because that's who Rob Bottin was. The final Kuato puppet required 6 operators, 6 human beings hidden completely beneath the host actor Michael Champion's coat, working in absolute silence, coordinating every single movement. One person controlled the eyes, one controlled the mouth, others managed the breathing mechanism, the subtle chest rise and fall that made Kuato feel like something with lungs. They rehearsed for weeks before a single frame was shot. They developed a system of hand signals so they could communicate without making a sound. Think about that for a second. 6 people crammed under a jacket in the heat of a film set, unable to speak, working in total darkness, trying to make something impossible feel real. The sting. Kuato opens his eyes and says, "Open your mind. You are watching 6 invisible people working in perfect silence to make you believe something that cannot exist." Studio wanted Kuato simplified. They floated the idea of making him a hologram, a disembodied voice, something cheaper, something cleaner, something that didn't require 6 operators and weeks of rehearsal, and a puppet that cost more to build than some entire film productions. Verhoeven said no. He said it with the kind of calm certainty that directors who have already made RoboCop can afford to use. And that stubbornness is exactly why the scene still works today. 35 years later, Kuato is still real, still breathing. He's still looking at you with those small, wet eyes. But Kuato isn't even the thing the studio was most afraid of. Number 4. The eyeball scene was almost rated X. You know exactly which scene this is. You don't need me to describe it at length. You can feel it just from me mentioning it. That specific full-body cringe. Your face moves involuntarily when you think about it. Quaid pulls a tracking device out of his own nose. On screen, in close-up, the object is enormous. It shouldn't fit. His face stretches around it in a way that faces should not be capable of stretching. The sound design makes it worse. The sound design makes it so much worse. The prop itself was custom-built by Bottin's team in multiple versions for different stages of the extraction. The nasal cavity prosthetic was made from soft, flesh-toned silicone. Required Schwarzenegger to cooperate with the insert process, which by all accounts was genuinely unpleasant, before the puppet appliances took over for the most extreme close-up frame. He described the experience in interviews as deeply uncomfortable in a way he wasn't expecting. Done action films, been through physical production shoots that would break most people. The nose scene still got to him. That discomfort is visible in every single frame, and it was supposed to be. MPAA ratings board flagged this scene during their review for violence in the traditional sense, not for blood or weapon usage or anything they had a clean category for. They flagged it for what one board member reportedly described as gross biological horror. The implication that the human body could be violated and distorted in that specific way, captured in that specific loving close-up, was something they didn't have a box to check for. Verhoeven trimmed exactly 4 seconds. 4. Version sitting in your memory. The version you watched with your hands over your face and your teeth pressed together still contains almost everything they wanted gone. 4 seconds of less is what compliance looked like. And that brings us to the scene that didn't just disturb audiences. It made the crew physically ill. Number 5. The decompression ending made crew members sick. The finale of Total Recall takes place in near vacuum conditions on the Martian surface. Quaid and Melina are expelled from the pressurized facility. Their eyes bulge outward. Their skin distends and bloats. Their faces do things in those frames that human faces are never supposed to do. It lasts only seconds on screen. It feels longer, much longer. Every single moment of that sequence was achieved practically. The actors wore partial prosthetic appliances built around the orbital bones, carefully engineered to push the eye area forward under specific lighting conditions. The full, extreme distortion was achieved through animatronic face pieces built by Bottin's team and triggered by puppeteers working just off-camera, watching monitors and operating controls with the same precision as surgeons. During the shooting of these sequences across multiple days, several crew members reported feeling genuinely nauseous. Not from the visual of the effects themselves, though those were disturbing enough. From the sound. The sound design team, working with Verhoeven's direct input, constructed the audio landscape for the decompression sequence using recordings of pressurized industrial air escaping heavy-gauge containers. Those recordings were then slowed down to between 40 and 60% of their original speed and layered with low-frequency bass tones generated digitally, tones that sit right at the frequency range that the human body's autonomic nervous system interprets as a threat signal. Between 18 and 19 hertz, below the threshold of conscious hearing, felt in the chest and the gut rather than processed by the ear. Played at full reference volume on set during sound reviews, those tones triggered genuine physical discomfort in multiple crew members. Verhoeven knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just building a scene you'd watch, building a scene that would reach through the screen and touch something animal inside you. The sting. You weren't just watching bodies dying in a vacuum. You were feeling it in a frequency your conscious mind couldn't identify or defend against. But even that ending, as visceral and punishing as it is, was not the ending Verhoeven actually wanted. And the version he originally cut together would have changed everything about how you remember this movie. Number 6. Verhoeven's original ending was considered too dark to release. The film ends with a sunrise, terraforming, the Martian atmosphere blooming into something breathable. Quaid and Melina alive standing together, looking at a sky that is turning blue for the first time in the history of a planet. Music swells. The screen goes bright. You exhale. That is not how Verhoeven wanted it to end. His original cut, the version that went into the first TriStar screening, held on Quaid's face for an additional 40 seconds after the sunrise began. No music, no romantic resolution, no confirmation, just Quaid's face in medium close-up, staring at the light, blinking slowly, uncertain. The expression on his face was not relief. It was the expression of a man who has just realized he cannot trust anything he has experienced, including the thing that is happening to him right now, because the entire film has been asking one question: is any of this real? Is Quaid actually on Mars? Is this a rescue mission? Or is it a recall fantasy that went wrong, that is still going wrong, that he is experiencing in a chair somewhere on Earth while his body slowly dies? Verhoeven's original ending did not answer that question. It refused to. It held on Quaid's face and let the uncertainty sit there, heavy and permanent, and then it cut to black. Resolution, no sunrise metaphor telling you it was all real. Nothing. You would have walked out of the theater carrying that question like a stone in your coat pocket. It would have been there the next morning, the next week, years later, at 2 a.m. You would have thought about that face. TriStar saw the cut and demanded a change within 24 hours of the screening. Notes they sent Verhoeven used words like alienating and punishing and audience hostile. They said the ending undermined the entire emotional investment of the film. They said people needed release. They said the sunrise had to mean something definitive. They added the music. They extended the terraforming sequence. They gave you the emotional exhale you were looking for. Vin complied. He has spoken about it in interviews across the years since, with a tone that is not quite bitterness. It is something quieter than bitterness, something closer to grief. The ending sitting in your memory was softened. You were protected from the one he actually built for you. It sounds fake. It's not. Number 7. Rob Bottin worked himself into a hospital. This is the part that hurts. Rob Bottin was already a legend before Total Recall. He was 23 years old when he did The Howling. He was 24 when he began work on The Thing, the project that is still considered by working practical effects artists to be the single greatest achievement in the history of the craft. He worked on The Thing for over a year without a single day off. He slept in the workshop. He lost weight, pushed himself past the point where most people would have stopped. And then he pushed further because the work wasn't done, and the work was everything. Verhoeven brought him on to Total Recall. Bottin treated it the same way he treated everything, like a mission, like something that mattered beyond the paycheck, beyond the credit, beyond what any reasonable person would call a healthy relationship with employment. He supervised every single creature design personally. He built approval processes for his team where nothing left the workshop without his eyes on it. He was on set for the major effects sequences, watching monitors, calling adjustments, refusing to let anything through that didn't meet the standard he had set in his own head. A standard that no one else could fully see or measure because it existed only inside Rob Bottin's understanding of what real looked like when it was wearing a latex face. His team was working 18-hour days in the final months of production. 18 hours of foam and paint and silicone and sweat under studio lights, and then a few hours of sleep, and then back in. Bottin was keeping pace with all of it, pace for all of it. When principal photography wrapped, Rob Bottin was hospitalized. The diagnosis covered exhaustion, severe sleep deprivation, and what his physicians described as a systemic physical collapse. His body had simply stopped being able to maintain the pace his mind had set for. He did not attend the premiere of Total Recall. The mutants you see on screen, the ones that made you feel something move in your stomach that you couldn't name, exist because one man decided that his own physical limits were a problem to be worked around rather than respected. He burned himself down to make those things real, paid for that decision with his health. Nobody mentions his name when they talk about this movie. Schwarzenegger gets the poster. Verhoeven gets the auteur essays. Bottin gets a credit that scrolls by in 12 seconds. Now you know his name. Number 8. The studio tried to replace mutant extras with digital copy. Here is something that almost no one in the mainstream conversation about this film discusses. In the later stages of post-production in 1989, TriStar made a formal approach to Verhoeven about a cost reduction measure tied to the mutant market sequence. That sequence, the crowded, chaotic scene on the streets of Mars, populated by dozens of deformed and mutated background characters, was one of the most expensive single sequences in the film to produce. Every background mutant was a costume performer. Every costume was a Bottin creation that had taken hours, sometimes a full day, to apply correctly. The logistics of getting 40 or 50 fully costumed mutant performers on set simultaneously, fed, watered, kept in costume, and functional across a full shooting day, was enormous. TriStar had been watching the early development of digital compositing technology with significant interest. They had consultants who believed that select background mutant figures could be duplicated digitally and composited into the crowd scenes, reducing the number of physical performers needed and cutting a meaningful portion of the production cost. They brought this to Verhoeven in a formal meeting with a presentation. He shut it down before the presentation finished. His argument was not about technology or feasibility or the state of digital effects in 1989. It was about something more fundamental than that, something that working directors who truly understand visual storytelling know in a place below conscious reasoning. He said that the audience's subconscious mind is a lie detector that has never been fooled, that when you place a digital body in a frame next to a practical body, something in the viewer's brain registers the difference before their eyes do. They don't know what they're seeing. They don't think that's CGI. They just stop believing. The emotional connection breaks. The world stops feeling like a world and starts feeling like a production. Every grotesque, distorted, unforgettable face in that market sequence is a real person wearing real foam and real paint under real lights. Someone's actual hands are reaching out of those sleeves. Someone's actual eyes are looking through those prosthetic eye surrounds. That is why the sequence still holds. That is why you believe Mars, not because of the set design or the cinematography or the script, because every single body in that frame is real, and your nervous system knows it, even when your brain doesn't think to ask. The sting. The digital age has tried to retroactively argue that practical effects were a limitation. Verhoeven understood in 1989 that they were the whole point. Number 9. The film's violence was used to smuggle the horror past the censors. Here is the final secret, one that ties everything together. Total Recall was rated R for violence, action violence, Schwarzenegger violence, gunfights and explosions, and the kind of kinetic, almost cartoonish brutality that the MPAA in 1990 had a very clear and comfortable box for. Arnold shoots people, people fall down. That's an R. That's fine. That's commando territory. That's manageable. What Verhoeven understood, and what the ratings board didn't fully process until it was too late, was that he was using the action film rating as cover for something much stranger and more disturbing. The mutant effects, the body horror, the biological wrongness threaded through the entire visual language of the film. These things were attached to a movie that the system had already categorized as action. By the time anyone looked closely enough at what the mutant sequences were actually doing to audiences, the rating was already assigned and the release was already scheduled. Verhoeven made a horror film and got it rated and distributed as a summer blockbuster. He put Kuato and the three-breasted woman and the eyeball scene and the decompression faces inside a movie that the studio was selling with a picture of Arnold Schwarzenegger holding a gun. The Sting. You went in thinking you were watching an action movie. You came out having experienced something that your body remembered differently than your brain did. That gap between what you thought you saw and what actually happened to you while you were watching it, that's the trick. That's the whole trick. And it worked on millions of people who never saw it coming. Total Recall was not a film that was made. It was a film that was survived by Bottin, who left pieces of his health in that workshop, by Verhoeven, who fought every compromise and lost only the ones they physically took from him in the editing room, by every actor and background performer who sat in that makeup chair for 6, 7, 8 hours and walked out the other side looking like something that had fallen through a crack in the biology of the world. The studio tried to sand the edges down. They tried to replace the bodies with pixels. They tried to cut the scenes that made their own executives uncomfortable. They added a sunrise at the end of a movie that was never supposed to have one. They got 4 seconds worth of cuts, a sunrise, and a slightly less ambiguous fade to black. The mutants are still there. The eyeball is still there. Kuato is still breathing, run by 6 invisible people in total silence, asking you to open your mind. And the question of whether any of it was real is still sitting in your pocket right now, even if you haven't thought about it in years. If you survived this video, hit like. And I need to know, what is the one movie scene you can never fully unsee? The one that lives in the back of your head at 2 a.m. Tell me below. I read every single one.